just want to say it really quick because I just have it on my mind. The men's business meeting was excellent. We had a lot of good encouragement, and Chance brought up what I said there, and I'll say it again. There are congregations around us who do not have what we have. Now, they are doing the work, and they're doing good things, but they're struggling in some areas that we don't have those struggles, and we need to appreciate the good fellowship we have, the youth size that we have, the number of members that are doing the work, and God is pleased with what's going on here. But because of that, Satan doesn't like it. And so we have to keep in mind that Satan is going to tempt us to dismantle and really take away what we do have. And so we have to be on guard. We have to remember who our Lord is. We serve the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, we are no longer under Moses' law, and so we don't observe the Sabbath. But it is still going to mean something to us, hopefully after this lesson, that he is still Lord of the Sabbath and what that means for us. Under the Old Covenant, Moses' law, the Sabbath was made for the people of Israel to rest and to worship God. They were to reflect on what he has done for them. They were not to go out there into hard labor. It was a day that represented God's rest from creation. It was one of the foundational laws there in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And there in Exodus chapter 20, it reminds them of why they had a Sabbath. It connected to that day of rest. That day God ceased from his works. And so they were to likewise cease from their works and reflect on God. Exodus 34 would tell them again, do not go out and plow. Don't harvest. Don't do that on the Sabbath. You are to rest. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. They're told again before they go into the land of Canaan, they need to honor the Sabbath. And then he gives them motivation. Why? There in Deuteronomy 5, he tells them, well, because God delivered you from Egypt. You have been taken out of slavery, so you must observe the Sabbath. Keep it holy. Well, the Pharisees came around, and they came to Jesus, and they accused him of dishonoring the Sabbath. He was not keeping it. And this was a huge accusation. Why? Because it's part of Moses' law. And Jesus was under Moses' law. He lived in that time it was in effect, and he was an Israelite. He was a Hebrew. And so he had to honor the Sabbath. And so when they accused him of not observing the Sabbath, what they were doing was trying to prove that he was a sinner. Well, if Jesus was a sinner, then he could not be that Messiah. He could not be that anointed one. He could not be that one to take away the sins of mankind. He could not be the one John was talking about, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. He couldn't be that one because he's sinning. And so for us, it is important, even though we're not under this law, even though we don't have this Sabbath, this is still important for us to look at, because if Jesus sinned under his law, then he could not be that Messiah. And so Mark is going to quickly recap some occasions where Jesus is going to refute this accusation. He's going to correct their thinking. And so here we have Jesus eats on the Sabbath, Mark chapter 2, and verse 23 through 28. Mark chapter 2, verse 23 says, Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of the grain. And the Pharisees said to him, Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But he said to them, Have you never read? Can you imagine how they felt? I mean, these are Pharisees. Pharisees are known for not only reading the old law, they have memorized it. and this was before the time they had chapter and verse numbers. They memorized the structure. They had to know the format, the literary structure, all the different poetical devices to help them memorize. They knew the law in their mind. And he says, have you ever read? And he doesn't tell them where he's talking about, but we would know as far as the chapter and verse numbers, it's 1 Samuel chapter 21. That's what he's talking about. Have you never read? That's a big accusation for them. Have you never read? Look at verse 25. Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is the holy bread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. Now, Jesus, keep that in mind about David, but he's eating on the Sabbath. Was this a sin? Is this what God was talking about when it came to the Sabbath laws? Well, if you look at Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 10, coupled with Deuteronomy 23 in that law system, Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 23, it allows the poor people to eat off the grains that people would leave on the corners of their property. Now, first, the people had to leave the corners untouched. That way, when the poor are walking by, they can pluck the heads off the grain. They could do this even on the Sabbath. They're just eating. This is drastically different than taking a tool, a sickle of something, and harvesting, and out there in hard labor, they're just plucking the grains and eating. On this same day, the people who were not poor, they would be in their house, and they would pick up food on their plate, and they would eat. It's the same thing, only in a different place. So what is the difference between them eating in their house? Now, they had to prepare all this food the day before, but their food was still there, and they would get it and eat it. Jesus doesn't have to prepare the food. It's right there. Him and his disciples can just pluck it off and eat it. And it was allowed. It was specifically allowed by God. Now, Jesus and his disciples were not rich. They were not rich. They were considered the poor. And so for them to take the heads off the grain, it was allowed because, well, they weren't physically rich. This is not considered hard labor. This is not what God was talking about. Also, on the Sabbath, the Jews were to worship God. Now, when Jesus and his disciples were plucking off the grain, did that somehow take away all the time that they had, and they had no room for worship? Oh, we've been plucking heads off the grain all day. There's no room for worship. All they did was pluck it off, and they ate and went about their business. And we know from other scriptures, like in Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, that it was customary for Jesus on the Sabbath to go to the synagogue and worship. He had plenty of time. Either he ate before he went to the synagogue, or he did it after. Either way, he had plenty of time. There's no room to break the law. There's no breaking of the law. If he broke Moses' law, he would have sinned. And he would not have been able to place our sins on the cross. You see, he was that pure lamb, without blemish, without spot, as Peter says. He was put on the cross, and he bore our sins. Hebrews chapter 4:15 says he is a high priest. He cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but in all points was tempted as we are, yet without sin. So he had no sin. 2 Corinthians 5:21, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might be the righteousness of God in him. Well, if he sinned on the Sabbath, then all those verses are lying. Then he was not that high priest that was tempted like we are, yet without sin. He was not that one who was made sin for us. And so it is important that we listen to what Jesus is saying and how he's refuting this. What did he exactly violate here? There in verse 24, and the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Nowhere did they break the law. And so what they are violating is the man-made laws that the Pharisees made. The Pharisees, see, in their mind, they're thinking, we don't want to sin. And so in order to stay away from the sin, we're going to create all these laws before it so we won't even get close. So they have all these laws, hundreds of them, to the point where it is just impossible for the people to follow them. It's just all these certain laws, and one of them was, do not pluck the grains off the field during that day. Don't even pick something up. Don't tie a knot. Don't get water from the well. I mean, they couldn't do anything. And the people, they had a hard time because they had all these laws and they're trying to memorize. Well, it was hard enough just to memorize God's law, and then they had to memorize all these other laws. The Pharisees were placing burdens on people. And they're saying, look, they're plucking grain, see? But Jesus is going to refute their thinking. He starts with David. He says, have you not read about David? Now, some have tried to say this is God's way of saying it's okay to break the law as long as there's a good result that ends. Jesus is talking about David. Don't you remember when David, he was hungry and he sinned? And so therefore we can sin as long as there's a good result. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. He is showing their inconsistent thinking. That's what he's doing right here. You see, David, he's a great king, and rightfully so. He was a great king. He was the one who represented that Messiah to come. The Messiah would come through his line. He was a great king that all the other kings would really be put to the test. Was he like David or was he not? And so David was a great king. And Jesus is saying, you know that great King David that y'all revere so much? He sinned. And yet you have no problems with David. How come you don't say, well, David was never king then, or he's not who he said he was, or, why don't you say bad things about him? He sinned, and he did what was unlawful. He even says that here. He says, which is not lawful to eat except the priests. They had this holy bread in the temple, and only the priest could eat that. It was holy bread. Well, in that time, David comes, and he's running from Saul. He's fearing for his life. He has men with him. They're all hungry. And then he lies to that high priest. He says, well, I'm here because the king sent me on business. And so, can you please give me some bread? He says, well, I don't have any bread except this holy bread. David says, it's okay. And so the bread is given and they eat. Well, how come the Pharisees don't say anything about that? And yet, the ultimate king, King Jesus, is there. He's proving who he is. And he has not sinned, and yet they're refusing to obey him. There's this inconsistent thinking here. It doesn't make sense. And he's showing how their thinking doesn't make sense. Well, Jesus did not sin. And second, he shows, well, if you're going to reject me, how much more should you reject David then? If Jesus said it was okay for David to eat the showbread, then what Jesus would also be saying is that David was okay for lying, because he did that on that day too. He came to Abiathar, the high priest, and said, it's okay, Saul sent me on some business. That's not what happened. He's fleeing from Saul. And so in the time, he ate the showbread. He shouldn't have done that. He also lied. And so if Jesus is trying to prove that it's okay for David to do this, then it was okay for David to lie. Now think about this. If Jesus is then saying that lying is okay, how do we know that Jesus is not lying? Maybe Jesus has been lying all along for good results. But the fact is, Jesus does not teach such a false system. He did not sin. And Jesus calls himself what? The Son of Man. Look at verse 27. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Hold that thought. Look at verse 28. Therefore the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. All this kind of goes together. Focus on real quick on the Son of Man. Now, yes, there is some meaning behind it, that Son of Man, he is from humanity. Yes, that is in there. He's a son, he's a child of a human, and so he is the Son of Man, yes. But this is also a title that shows his authority. There's much more to it than just humanity. It does have that, but there's more to it. Do a study on that. And you'll come across John 5:27, where John says, or records, on how Jesus is talking about the Son of Man, and how God the Father has given the Son, he has given him, Jesus, the authority to execute judgment. And he gives the reason. He says he has given him all authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. And so that Son of Man, it means more. It's this title that says he has authority. He has the authority to place judgment. Even here, it's coupled with some wording that tells you there's much more to Son of Man than just humanity. Therefore, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. Lord is master. He has authority over the Sabbath. This makes him different from what's said in 27. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But yet this Son of Man is over the Sabbath. Which means, yes, he's human, but he's much more. He's much more than just a mere man. He is God. He is the one that made the Sabbath. He made all the laws. He not only did not violate the Sabbath, he made the Sabbath. And why did he make the Sabbath? He made it for man and not the other way around. In other words, the Sabbath was to help man worship God, give them a time of reflection, give them some rest time. It was made for them, not the other way around. Man was not made to be over the Sabbath, to alter it, add laws, take away laws, have authority over it. No, that's not how it worked. He made the Sabbath for them. And who's the Lord of the Sabbath? The Son of Man. Who's that? That's Jesus. What he is doing here is, you do not have the right to change the Sabbath. And also, I am the one who made the Sabbath. I'm over the Sabbath. Well, there are two things that the Pharisees, as you know, keep going on. There are two things they will keep trying to accuse Jesus of. Not observing the Sabbath and making himself equal with God. Jesus hit both of them. He says, I am God, and I'm not violating the Sabbath. Now, what do we learn as far as we're concerned? Well, we do learn through principle that we do not create laws that are not there. Now, there are times where God allows us or gives us some allowance on when we're going to do certain things like worship. But it cannot violate outside of this day. But what hour, he has not told us. And so we have decided we're going to meet 9:30 Bible class, 10:30 worship. Okay, we decided 10:30. Nowhere in the Bible does it say 10:30, but we know it has to be in this day. There are times where we do have that allowance, but we have to be careful not to make laws where there are no laws. We have to make sure that we're in line with the Scriptures. It is no different in Christ's law. Second, let us not break the laws that are there. And so that's what we learn here. This is what pleases Jesus. But also, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Look at chapter 3 and verse 1. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there and had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So they're not done yet. You know, this tells us a couple of things. This tells us that right before, whenever he said this to them, they understood and they had nothing to say. They had no room. Okay, well, he made a point there. We have nothing. And so we're going to wait for another thing on the Sabbath. And second, isn't it interesting that they have no problem with knowing that he can perform a miracle. You see, to them, they understood this is not magic. You know, they could have said, well, he's just one of the sorcerers that do magic tricks out there in the street. You know, he's just a street magician. They never said that. They never even touched that argument. Instead, they had no room to say this is not a miracle, because then they would have looked foolish. People would have said, it is a miracle. What are you talking about? So they had to think, okay, it is a miracle, but how are we going to get him? Okay, we're going to wait till he does a miracle on the Sabbath, and then we'll get him. Look at verse 3. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? But they kept silent, because he had a good point. The day was just a day not to do hard labor. It never, ever told them, oh, and also don't help anybody. You know, oh, and don't perform no miracles. There was nothing in there that said that. And that's why he's saying, can I not do good on the Sabbath? And what hard labor was there? What did he do? Look at verse 5. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Oh no, Jesus is doing so much work here. It's taking all day. It's just hard labor. All he did was speak. Hands restored. Stretch out your hand. That's what he said. There was nothing in Moses' law that said you couldn't talk. It's just God showing his compassion on that day. Jesus knew their thinking. Jesus asked, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or evil? Healing a man's hand was not evil. And it was not a long, drawn-out process. The Pharisees, they did not want to sin. And for that, yes, we look at that. It's a good thing, a good motive. But they went too far in making these laws where there are no laws. Nowhere Moses' law said, don't tell a man to stretch out the hand, and don't you heal that hand. God never said that. Now, by principle, does this happen today? And sadly, yes. Now, we're not under Moses' law, but we can still look back and we can gain some lessons. And then we can look at what's happening around us. Some examples would include Christians forbidding other Christians to eat on the church grounds. That's a real thing. Forbidding anyone from chewing gum on the parking lot. That is a real law, man-made law, that is out there. Forbidding members from taking care of orphans. Forbidding all English translations except the King James. Cannot go outside of King James. Don't get me wrong, King James is a very good translation, but it is not the only one to use. Forbidding women to wear jeans. I mean, on goes the list. There are all sorts of different laws that man will make, and then they'll try to enforce it on everybody. That is not right when it comes to Christ's law. These are real laws that people have tried to put, but Satan, we see that he continues to tempt people the same way even today. Well, what does this mean as far as our Sabbath? Jesus is going to return for our Sabbath. I want us to turn to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4. We're fast forwarding in time. Jesus has already done his work. He's went off to heaven. The church has started. And now the Hebrew writer, interestingly, is helping these Christians not go back to Moses' law. That law has fulfilled its purpose. Not that it was a bad law, but it served its purpose. It brought us to this time. And the Hebrew writer is saying, let's get back to Christ. Let's stay in his law. Here's the motivation for this in Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4. Look at verse 4. For he has spoken in a certain place on the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as it has been said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. Just a quick side note there in verse 8. Maybe your translation says, for if Jesus, but this is talking about Joshua. Joshua and Jesus are really the same name. Jesus comes from the Greek version and Joshua from the Hebrew version. But the context demands that it's talking about Joshua way before Jesus. Okay, for if Joshua had given them a rest, then he, David, would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. So what is being talked about here? Okay, I'm about to walk away from the podium. Making sure that's on. Here we have way before they come into the land of Canaan. And God says, yes, they're going to go in the land, but they're not going to find rest. Other places say they do find rest, but there's other places he says they're not. In what sense are they not going to gain rest? Well, the Hebrew writer's working up to that. They come in, Joshua brings them in. Years later, David becomes king, and he says there still remains a rest to come. He's in the land already, way after Joshua. And that's why the Hebrew writer says, why does David say that? Because there still remains this rest to come in the future. Them coming in Israel was not the ultimate rest God has been talking about. There's another rest. And it's related to the Sabbath, but it's not the Sabbath under Moses' law. There in verse 9, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. I know we don't see this in the English. And this is where very fine details really help us. Okay? There, the rest, it translates the word sabbatismos. Y'all hear a word in that? Sabbatismos. You hear Sabbath? But the usual word for Sabbath is a bit different. It is as if the writer is creating a new word from the word Sabbath. This word, it's unique. You really don't find it anywhere. It's different from the usual word for Sabbath. And he creates this word. It's Sabbath rest for the people of God. In other words, for Christians, as far as where we're at and what we know, there is a day coming, and that's going to be our Sabbath rest. We're not under Moses' law anymore. That has been done. Therefore, we don't follow the Ten Commandments, that we don't honor the Sabbath. But when we look at it, it's still for our benefit. We look at the Ten Commandments and the Sabbath. You know why God made that? Because he was helping people understand the great Sabbath day that was to come. That day when Jesus, the Lord, he is going to come and judge the world. Why? Because he's the Son of Man. He's going to judge the world, and he's going to gather up his people, and he's going to bring us to God the Father, and we're going to rest there in heaven. It's going to be an eternal day. So whenever God rested on that seventh day, he already had in his mind, okay, this is going to help people understand heaven. And then as time goes on, he creates the Sabbath law for the Israelites. God already has in his mind, this is going to help them understand something that is to come. That's what the Hebrew writer is saying. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not have spoken of another day. There he says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Why? Because there's another day coming. That's his point. Don't go back to Moses' law. Don't go back to doing what you want. Stick with Christ, because there is coming a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And so truly, Jesus is still the Lord of the Sabbath. For us, what does that mean? For the Sabbath rest to come, the Lord is going to come, and he's going to come for us. Therefore, we must abide by his rules. We must not place rules where there are no rules. We must not take away rules that are there. We must not misinterpret the rules. We have to be careful with them. We have to observe them under Christ's law. Why? Because there's a Sabbath rest coming for those who obey. Maybe there's one here who has not obeyed Christ's law. Maybe you're not ready for that great Sabbath rest to come. Maybe you've not been acting as if Christ is Lord, the Son of Man, the Lord of the Sabbath. Now it's time to get back to doing what he has said. Maybe you're not even a Christian. I say this with all the love in the world. You are not ready for that great and final day. That great day of rest. You're not ready. If you would like to get ready, we can have Bible study with you. But if you do know, don't hold back. Get right with God now as we stand and sing.